The call came at 2:37 a.m. on September 12, 1985. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on my nightstand, unable to sleep after a difficult case that had just concluded, when the phone rang with that particular urgency that meant my life was about to get complicated. Agent Whitmore? The voice belonged to Deputy Director Harrison, which immediately told me this wasn't a routine case. Deputy directors don't call field agents in the middle of the night unless something extraordinary has happened. "Yes, sir," I replied, sitting up and reaching for the notepad I kept by the bed. 15 years with the FBI had trained me to be ready for anything at any hour. "I need you on a plane to Woods Hole, Massachusetts in 3 hours. Dr. Robert Ballard's expedition has located the wreck of the Titanic. We're opening an investigation and I want you leading it." I was fully awake now, my mind racing through the implications. "Sir, the Titanic sank in 1912. That's 73 years ago. Why is the FBI investigating a maritime disaster that old? Isn't this a matter for maritime historians or the Navy? Because Dr. Ballard's team has found something unusual, something that doesn't fit the historical narrative we've all been taught. The president wants answers before this goes public, and he wants them from someone he can trust. You're that someone, Agent Whitmore. Pack for at least 2 weeks and bring your cold water gear. You'll be joining the research vessel Nor in the North Atlantic." "What kind of unusual findings are we talking about?" There was a pause on the line, and I could hear Harrison choosing his words carefully. "The damage to the ship's hull. It doesn't match what would be expected from an iceberg collision. It looks more like deliberate sabotage, possibly explosives. We need someone with your investigation experience to determine what really happened that night in 1912. My mind was already working through the possibilities. If this is sabotage, we're talking about one of the largest mass murders in history. 1,500 people died when that ship sank. Exactly. Which is why this investigation is classified at the highest levels. You will discuss it with no one outside the cleared team. Not your wife, not your colleagues, no one. A full briefing package will be waiting for you at Logan Airport. Agent Whitmore, I need to know you understand the gravity of this situation." "I understand, sir." "Good. There's a car waiting outside your house right now. The driver will take you to the airport. Your flight leaves in 2 hours and 45 minutes. Don't be late." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom for a moment, processing what I'd just been told. The Titanic had been found after more than 7 decades at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The most famous shipwreck in history had finally been located, and somehow, there was evidence suggesting it hadn't been an accident. I showered quickly, dressed in practical clothing suitable for work on a research vessel in the North Atlantic, and packed efficiently. My wife, Karen, appeared in the bedroom doorway as I was closing my suitcase, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "Middle of the night call from Harrison?" she said, not asking but stating. She'd been married to an FBI agent for 12 years. She knew the drill, knew the sacrifices, knew the secrets I couldn't share. "I'll be gone for a couple of weeks, maybe longer. Can't tell you where or why. I'm sorry." She crossed the room and hugged me tightly, the kind of embrace that said she understood the requirements of my work, but wished they weren't necessary. "Be safe, come home. That's all I ask." "Always do," I promised, though we both knew there had been close calls over the years. The drive to Logan Airport was surreal. The streets of Boston were mostly empty in the pre-dawn hours, lit by street lamps that cast long shadows across the pavement. The driver was silent, professional, almost certainly FBI or CIA based on his bearing and the way he constantly scanned his mirrors. I used the time to go over what I knew about the Titanic, which wasn't much beyond the basic facts every American learned in school. The RMS Titanic, the largest ship ever built at the time of its construction, proclaimed unsinkable by its designers and owners, struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York on April 14, 1912. The ship sank in less than 3 hours, taking more than 1,500 people with it. One of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history, a tragedy that had captured the public imagination for decades, inspiring books, films, and countless investigations into what went wrong. But that was all public knowledge, the story everyone knew. What could Dr. Ballard's team have found that would require FBI investigation? What evidence of sabotage could have survived 73 years at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean? At Logan Airport, I was met by a man I recognized from interagency meetings as CIA, though he didn't introduce himself or show credentials. He simply handed me a sealed briefing package marked with multiple security classifications and said, "Your flight is boarding at Gate 47. Don't open this until you're in a secure location. Good luck, Agent Whitmore." Then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn airport crowds like a ghost. The flight to Halifax, Nova Scotia took approximately 3 hours. I was seated in first class, the seats around me conspicuously empty despite the flight being otherwise full. Someone had made sure I'd have privacy for the flight. I used the time to think about the logistics of what I was about to do. From Halifax, I'd be taking a Coast Guard helicopter to the research vessel Knorr, currently positioned over the Titanic wreck site approximately 370 miles south-southeast of Newfoundland. The weather report I'd glimpsed on a monitor showed deteriorating conditions in the North Atlantic. A storm system was moving in that would make underwater operations difficult or impossible for the next several days. The helicopter flight from Halifax out to the Knorr was my first opportunity to review the briefing materials. I waited until we were airborne, and the noise of the rotors made conversation impossible before breaking the seals on the package. What I read in those first few pages made me understand why Deputy Director Harrison had been so cryptic on the phone. Dr. Robert Ballard's expedition, using a revolutionary deep-sea camera system called Argo, towed behind the research vessel, had located the Titanic wreck on September 1st, 1985, 11 days ago. The ship was resting at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, roughly 370 miles south-southeast of Newfoundland. The wreck was in two main pieces, the bow section relatively intact and upright, the stern section heavily damaged and partially collapsed, the two pieces separated by approximately 2,000 feet of debris field. The initial surveys had documented what they expected to find, a massive ship broken in half, debris scattered across the ocean floor, the remains of one of history's most infamous disasters. The images were haunting. The ship's famous bow rising from the ocean floor, intact enough that you could still see the railing where passengers had stood on that fatal night, twisted metal and collapsed decks, personal belongings scattered across the sediment, shoes, dishes, furniture, the detritus of 2,500 lives cut short. But then they'd found something that didn't fit the narrative, something that changed everything. The photographs in the briefing package showed images captured by the underwater cameras. Most showed what you'd expect from a shipwreck: deterioration, collapse, the inevitable decay that comes from decades underwater. But one series of images showed something different. Markings on the hull. Not damage from the sinking, not deterioration from 73 years of exposure to seawater and pressure, but deliberate marks that appeared to have been made before the ship went down. The markings were on the starboard side, near where the iceberg supposedly struck. But instead of the expected damage pattern, a long gash or series of punctures that would be consistent with ice tearing through steel plating, the hull showed what looked like precisely placed explosive damage. Small circular breaches in a pattern that the naval architects consulted by the expedition said looked more like demolition charges than iceberg impact. I studied the photographs carefully. My investigative instincts immediately engaged. The damage pattern was too regular, too symmetrical, too precise. Nature doesn't create patterns like that. Icebergs don't punch circular holes in steel hulls with mathematical precision. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was murder. But there was more in the briefing package. Much more. Classified documents from 1912 that I'd never seen before, never even knew existed. Reports from U.S. intelligence officers who'd been quietly investigating rumors of sabotage in the immediate aftermath of the sinking. Witness statements from Titanic survivors who'd reported seeing strange things that night, mysterious lights in the water before the collision, hearing what sounded like explosions rather than the scraping impact described in the official inquiry, seeing crew members acting strangely in the hours before the disaster. There were intercepted German diplomatic communications from early 1912, cryptic references to the Atlantic operation and American commercial disruption, and the implementation of contingency protocols. The intercepts were fragmentary, incomplete, but they painted a disturbing picture of German intelligence activity focused on disrupting American economic interests in the months before the Titanic sailed. And there were financial records showing that several prominent American businessmen and political figures who'd been planning to sail on the Titanic had canceled their passages at the last minute. Not just one or two, but more than a dozen high-profile cancellations in the final week before departure, all citing sudden business complications, family emergencies, or health concerns. The cancellations had been noted at the time but dismissed as coincidence. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and the evidence of sabotage, they looked like something else entirely, like warnings that someone had issued to protect certain individuals from what was about to happen. The picture that emerged from these documents was profoundly disturbing. What if the Titanic hadn't hit an iceberg at all? What if it had been deliberately destroyed? What if 2,500 people had been murdered to accomplish some political or economic objective? And if so, by whom and why? What could possibly justify mass murder on that scale? The helicopter began its descent toward the Nore, and I could see the research vessel below, pitching in increasingly rough seas. The storm was coming in faster than predicted. The pilot's voice crackled over my headset. "Better hurry once we touch down, Agent Whitmore. This storm is going to ground us for at least 2 days once we get you aboard. Could be longer if it's as bad as it looks." The landing was rough, the helicopter's skids bouncing on the heaving deck before crew members rushed out to secure it with chains. I grabbed my gear and the briefing materials and hurried across the deck toward the main cabin, salt spray soaking me despite the short distance. The sea was already building, waves beginning to crash over the railings, the wind picking up to a howl. Dr. Robert Ballard was waiting for me just inside the main cabin, a bearded man in his early 40s with intense, intelligent eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in days. With him were several members of his team, along with 2 men I immediately recognized as fellow federal agents by their bearing and the way they positioned themselves in the room. "Agent Whitmore, I'm Dr. Ballard. Welcome aboard the Nore, though I wish the circumstances were different. These are Agents Chen and Morrison from Naval Intelligence and Agent Rodriguez from the State Department. We've been expecting you." Naval Intelligence and State Department? This was even bigger than I'd realized. Whatever we'd found down there, it had implications that went far beyond a historical mystery. "Thank you, Dr. Ballard. I've reviewed the preliminary briefing materials. I'd like to see everything you've collected. All the imagery, all the data, everything. And I need to understand your timeline. When did you first notice the irregularities in the hull damage?" Ballard led me deeper into the ship, through narrow corridors that smelled of salt water and machine oil, into the operations center where banks of monitors showed underwater footage and technical readouts. "We found the wreck on September 1st, as you know. The initial surveys were focused on confirming it was actually the Titanic and assessing the overall condition of the wreck. It wasn't until we started detailed surveys of the hull that we noticed the damage pattern was wrong." He pulled up a series of images on the monitors. "This is the starboard side, the area where the iceberg supposedly struck. According to the historical accounts, the iceberg tore a series of openings in the hull below the waterline, allowing water to flood the forward compartments. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, calculated that the ship could survive flooding in 4 compartments, but not 5 or 6. The iceberg supposedly damaged enough compartments to doom the ship. "But that's not what you found," I said, studying the images. "No, what we found is this." He zoomed in on specific sections of the hull. "These are blast patterns. I've seen enough underwater ordnance to recognize the signature. These aren't tears or punctures from ice impact. These are entry points from shaped charges or similar explosives. Small, precisely placed, designed to breach the hull in specific locations." Agent Chen from Naval Intelligence spoke up. "We've consulted with ordnance experts and naval architects. The consensus is that these damage patterns are consistent with demolition charges placed against the hull from the inside. Someone aboard the Titanic set explosives that would ensure the ship sank quickly." "From the inside?" I asked. "You're telling me this was an inside job? Someone on the crew or among the passengers planted explosives?" "That's the working theory," Rodriguez from State Department confirmed. which raises obvious questions about who, why, and whether this was a lone actor or part of a larger conspiracy. "How many charges are we talking about?" I asked. Ballard pulled up a schematic he'd created. "We've identified at least 6 separate blast points along the starboard hull, all below the waterline. The placement is sophisticated. They're positioned to compromise multiple watertight compartments simultaneously. Whoever did this understood the ship's design intimately. They knew exactly where to place charges to ensure maximum damage and rapid sinking." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold North Atlantic air seeping into the operations center. How long would it take a ship like the Titanic to sink if 6 watertight compartments were compromised simultaneously? "Approximately 2 to 3 hours, Ballard replied, "which matches the historical timeline. The ship struck the Iceberg at 11:40 p.m. and sank at 2:20 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes. Everyone assumed that timeline was determined by the extent of ice damage. But if it was actually determined by the placement of demolition charges, then someone planned this very carefully," I finished. "They knew exactly how long they had, long enough for the explosion to be blamed on an iceberg collision, for panic to set in, for the inadequate number of lifeboats to be overwhelmed, long enough for most people to die. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just sabotage. This was premeditated mass murder, planned and executed with chilling precision. There's something else," Ballard said quietly, glancing at his team members who'd been asked to step out of the room. Only the federal agents remained now. "Something I haven't reported to anyone except the Navy, the CIA, and the White House. We found evidence of a second vessel in the debris field." "What kind of evidence?" "Anchor chains that don't match Titanic's specifications, equipment that wasn't part of the ship's original manifest, and most troublingly, what appears to be a small submarine or submersible craft partially buried in the sediment about a quarter-mile from the main wreck. It's heavily corroded, but the design is unlike anything that should have existed in 1912. I stared at him. "A submarine in 1912? I know how it sounds. But Agent Whitmore, submarines existed in 1912. They were primitive compared to modern vessels, but several navies had operational submarines by then. The German Navy, for instance, had U-boats. Not the advanced submarines of World War II, but earlier models that were capable of limited operations. But could they operate in the mid-Atlantic? Could they reach the Titanic?" Ballard shook his head. "According to conventional history, no. The submarines of 1912 were coastal vessels, short-range, used primarily for harbor defense. They didn't have the range or endurance to operate hundreds of miles from land. But what if conventional history is wrong? What if someone had developed more advanced submarine technology than we've been told about?" Agent Morrison pulled out additional photographs. "We've been analyzing the submersible we found. The design incorporates features that shouldn't have existed in 1912, advanced battery systems, improved hull design, what looks like early sonar equipment. If this vessel was operational in 1912, it represents a significant gap in our understanding of naval technology development. Or, Agent Chen added, it represents a secret development program that was deliberately kept out of the historical record. A program that built advanced submarines years before they were supposed to exist, for purposes that remain unclear." I looked at the images of the mysterious submersible, my mind trying to process the implications. "You're suggesting that someone, presumably the same people who sabotaged the Titanic, had access to submarine technology that was decades ahead of its time. They used this technology to approach the Titanic, possibly to plant the explosives or to provide support for operatives aboard the ship. And then they covered up both the sabotage and the existence of their advanced submarines." "That's exactly what we're suggesting," Rodriguez confirmed, "which raises the question, who in 1912 had the resources, the technical capability, and the motivation to do something like this? And perhaps more importantly, who had the power to keep it secret for 73 years? The ship lurched violently as a large wave hit, and we all had to grab the table to maintain our balance. The storm was intensifying, the wind howling outside, the Nore beginning to pitch and roll in ways that tested even experienced sailors. "How long until you can get back down there?" I asked Ballard. "I need to see this submersible myself. I need more detailed imagery of those blast patterns. I need evidence that will stand up to scrutiny. At least 48 hours, maybe longer if this storm is as bad as the forecasts suggest," Ballard replied, looking frustrated. "But Agent Whitmore, there's something you need to understand. We're at the absolute limit of our technology down there. The Titanic is deeper than any shipwreck that's been extensively explored before. The pressure at 12,500 feet is enormous, more than 6,000 pounds per square inch. The visibility is limited. The currents are unpredictable. We're working with equipment that's experimental and temperamental. If there's evidence of sabotage or murder on that wreck, documenting it in a way that would be admissible in any kind of legal proceeding is going to be extraordinarily difficult." "I'm not worried about legal proceedings," I replied. "I'm worried about the truth. For 73 years, the world has believed the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. If that's not what happened, if 1,500 people were murdered rather than victims of an accident, then everything we think we know about that night is wrong. The victims deserve the truth. History deserves the truth." "What do you think happened to the iceberg?" Agent Chen asked suddenly. "If the ship didn't hit ice, why did survivors report seeing an iceberg? Why was ice found on the deck? The official inquiry documented ice damage. Were all those people lying?" It was a good question, one I'd been wrestling with since reading the briefing materials. "I don't know yet, but here's what I think. I think there probably was ice in the area that night. The North Atlantic in April is notorious for icebergs drifting south from Greenland. I think the saboteurs chose that time and place specifically because ice would be present, giving them a ready-made cover story for what they were about to do. They waited for the ship to be in an area where an iceberg collision would be plausible, then they triggered their explosives. In the chaos that followed, with the ship flooding and people panicking, it would be easy to convince everyone that they'd struck ice. But someone must have known the truth," Morrison said. "The officers who survived, the crew members who saw what really happened, they would have known it wasn't ice damage. Would they?" I countered. "In the dark, in the panic, with water flooding in and the ship beginning to list, how certain could anyone be about what they'd actually seen or heard? And if there was a cover-up, if powerful interests wanted the iceberg story to be accepted, survivors who contradicted that narrative might have been silenced or discredited." The ship lurched again, harder this time. Through the windows of the operations center, I could see the seas building to truly frightening heights, waves towering above the deck, wind-driven spray reducing visibility to almost nothing. We were in for a rough couple of days. "I suggest we use this time productively," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the storm. "Doctor Ballard, I want to review every piece of imagery your team has collected, every frame of video, every still photograph. I want to go through the historical documents again, looking for patterns and connections. And I want to start building a profile of who might have wanted the Titanic destroyed and who had the capability to do it." The other agents agreed. We settled in for what would prove to be 3 very long days aboard a ship being tossed like a toy by North Atlantic storms, digging through 73-year-old evidence of what might be one of the most significant cover-ups in modern history. But as I would discover over those 3 storm-tossed days and in the investigation that followed, the truth about the Titanic was far stranger and more disturbing than anything I'd imagined. The iceberg was never found because there was no iceberg. The ship had been deliberately destroyed, that much was becoming clear. But the reason why, the conspiracy that had kept it secret for 7 decades, and the powerful forces that were still working to prevent the truth from emerging, those revelations would challenge everything I thought I knew about history, about power, and about how far powerful people will go to protect their secrets. The Titanic wasn't a tragic accident. It was a crime scene, and I was about to become the first investigator in 73 years to document the crime and identify the criminals. Chapter 2. The Storm and the Secrets. The storm lasted 3 days, not the 2 that had been predicted. 3 days of the Nore being tossed like a cork in mountainous seas, of equipment breaking loose despite being secured, of crew members getting injured trying to maintain basic operations, of wondering if the ship itself would survive to continue the investigation at all. I spent most of that time in the operations center, reviewing footage and documents while trying to keep my stomach from rebelling against the violent motion of the ship. I'd been on boats in rough weather before, but nothing quite like this. Waves were crashing over the bow, sending water cascading across the deck. The wind was howling at sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour with gusts much higher. Several times the ship rolled so far that I was certain we were going to capsize. Dr. Ballard and his team worked through it all with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of experience at sea. They secured equipment, made repairs, monitored the weather, and somehow kept the ship functioning despite conditions that would have sent most vessels running for port. I used the enforced downtime to go through every frame of video Dr. Ballard's team had captured during their surveys of the wreck. The footage was extensive, hours and hours of underwater imagery showing the Titanic from every angle, documenting its slow decay at the bottom of the Atlantic. And the more I watched, the more convinced I became that what we were dealing with was deliberate sabotage, not an accidental collision. By the morning of the second day of the storm, I'd found something that changed my understanding of the case completely. "Dr. Ballard, I need you to look at something," I called out over the howl of the wind and the crash of waves against the hull. He made his way across the operations center, holding on to the walls and furniture to maintain his balance as the ship pitched and rolled. "What have you found?" I'd isolated a specific sequence of footage from the debris field, the area between the bow and stern sections where hundreds of objects from the ship had settled over the decades. "This footage is from your initial survey, September 2nd, the day after you found the wreck. The camera is moving across the ocean floor about 200 feet from the bow section. Tell me what you see here." Ballard leaned close to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he studied the grainy underwater imagery. "Debris. Looks like pieces of wood decking, some metal fixtures, possibly remnants of furniture or interior fittings. Pretty typical for a debris field from a ship that broke apart during sinking. Why? What am I missing? Look right here." I advanced the footage frame by frame, stopping on a particular object partially buried in the sediment. "Tell me what that is." Ballard's expression changed instantly, going from curious to shocked. That can't be right. That's impossible." What we were looking at was a cylindrical metal object, approximately 3 feet long and 6 inches in diameter, lying partially buried in the sediment. Despite 7 decades of corrosion and marine growth, the shape was unmistakable to anyone with military experience, and the markings on its side, though heavily corroded, were still partially visible, enough to identify what it was. "That's a torpedo," Ballard said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Or at least it was. Early 20th century design, possibly German based on the dimensions and what I can see of the propulsion system. But that's impossible. Agent Whitmore, that's completely impossible. The Titanic sank in 1912. Germany didn't have submarines capable of operating in the mid-Atlantic until well into World War I, years after the Titanic went down. Are you absolutely certain that's what it is?" I asked, though I could see in his eyes that he was. "I'd need to get a much closer look to be completely certain, but yes, I'm confident in the identification. I've conducted surveys of World War I shipwrecks. I've seen German torpedoes from that era. That's a G6 torpedo, or something very similar to it. The Germans started producing them around 1906, and they used them extensively from 1914 onwards in their U-boats." I pulled up another image, this one from a different section of the debris field. "And this?" The second image showed a section of hull plating that had been blown outward rather than inward. The metal was twisted and torn in a way that could only be explained by an explosion from inside the hull. The exact opposite of what would happen if the ship had struck an iceberg from the outside. "Internal explosion," Ballard confirmed, his voice grim. "I noticed some of these when we first surveyed the wreck, but I assumed they were from the boilers rupturing as the ship sank, or from the structural failure when it broke in half. But if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, someone placed explosives inside the ship," I finished. "They weren't trying to sink it with external weapons, they were destroying it from within. The torpedo, if that's what it really is, might have been a contingency plan or a distraction. But the real damage, the killing blow, was done by someone aboard the Titanic who had access to the interior of the ship." Agent Chen, who'd been monitoring our conversation, came over to the monitors. "That would explain why the ship sank so quickly. The official timeline has it going down in less than 3 hours after the collision. Naval architects have always been somewhat puzzled by that. A ship the size of the Titanic, with its advanced compartmentalization and watertight bulkheads, should have stayed afloat longer even with significant hull damage. But if there were internal explosions that compromised multiple watertight compartments simultaneously, that breached the integrity of the bulkheads themselves. It would sink like the proverbial stone, I agreed. Dr. Ballard, I need that torpedo retrieved. I need physical evidence, not just imagery. Can it be done? Ballard looked out at the storm-tossed seas, then back at the monitor. It's at 12,500 feet depth. We'd need to use Alvin, our deep submersible, to get down there and secure it for recovery. It's a technically challenging operation even in good conditions. With this storm, it's impossible. But once the weather clears, yes, it can be done. It's risky. The submersible can only stay down for about 4 hours with a safety margin, and recovery of an object that large and heavy would be complicated by the depth and the current. But it's possible. How soon after the weather clears can we attempt it? At least 24 hours. We need to let the seas calm completely before we can launch Alvin safely, and we need to plan the recovery operation carefully. If we lose that torpedo during recovery, if it falls back to the bottom or gets damaged, we might never get another chance. Then start planning, I ordered, because that torpedo is the key to everything. If we can prove it's German, if we can prove it was manufactured before 1912, if we can prove it was deployed in the mid-Atlantic when conventional history says that was impossible, then we have evidence of a conspiracy. We have proof that the Titanic wasn't sunk by an iceberg. It was destroyed by a deliberate act of war or terrorism. But Ballard looked troubled, and I knew he was wrestling with implications that went far beyond historical accuracy. Agent Whitmore, if we recover that torpedo, if we prove that the Titanic was sunk by German weapons, do you understand the geopolitical implications? Germany has been our ally for 40 years. We rebuilt their country after World War II. Our economies are intertwined. Our militaries cooperate. This could destabilize all of that. That's above my pay grade, I replied. My job is to find the truth about what happened to 5,500 people who died 73 years ago. What the politicians and diplomats do with that truth is their problem. But those people deserve to have their story told accurately. They deserve to have the world know they were murdered, not killed in an accident. But if Germany was responsible, Agent Rodriguez interjected, why would they do it? What possible motivation could Germany have had in 1912 to sink a British passenger liner? The Titanic was owned by the White Star Line, a British company. The ship was built in Belfast. Most of the passengers were British or American. Why would Germany target it? It was a good question, one I'd been pondering since discovering the evidence of sabotage. I don't know yet, but I have some theories. Let's look at the timeline. The Titanic sank in April 1912. World War I started in August 1914, just over 2 years later. The briefing materials mention intercepted German communications about an Atlantic operation. What if this wasn't random? What if Germany was already preparing for war in 1912 and the Titanic was somehow part of those preparations? Agent Morrison pulled up a file on his laptop. I've been researching the passenger list looking for anyone who might have been a strategic target, and I found something interesting. There were several prominent American businessmen on that ship. Men with significant influence in U.S. banking, industry, and politics. Men who were openly opposed to American involvement in European conflicts. Men who would have fought against U.S. entry into any European war. You think Germany was trying to eliminate American opposition to a future war? I asked. It's a theory. Or maybe they weren't trying to eliminate them. Maybe they were sending a message, demonstrating their capability to strike at Western economic interests anywhere in the world, even in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was a symbol of Western industrial might and confidence. Destroying it would have been a powerful statement. But it was blamed on an iceberg, Chen pointed out. If the goal was to send a message, why cover it up? Why not take credit? Because in 1912, Germany wasn't ready for war, I suggested. They were still building their military, still forming alliances, still preparing. An overt attack on a passenger liner would have triggered an immediate crisis, possibly war before they were ready. But if they could sink the ship and make it look like an accident, they could achieve their objective, eliminating potential opponents or demonstrating their capability. without triggering a premature conflict. The ship lurched violently, throwing us against the bulkhead. Alarms sounded as equipment came loose somewhere in the ship. Dr. Ballard rushed out to coordinate damage control, leaving the three agents alone in the operations center. "There's another possibility we should consider," Rodriguez said once Ballard was gone. "What if this wasn't a German operation at all? What if someone wanted us to think it was German?" "False flag," Morrison said immediately. "You're suggesting this was an operation by someone else, maybe British intelligence, maybe American interests, who wanted to create a pretext for future conflict with Germany." "It's possible," Rodriguez confirmed. "Think about it. If you wanted to ensure America would enter a European war on the side of Britain and France, what better way than to create evidence of German aggression against American civilians? The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 helped push America toward war. What if the Titanic was supposed to serve a similar purpose, but the plan went wrong somehow? The cover-up failed, or the political circumstances weren't right, so the incident was buried instead of being used as a catalyst for war. I considered the theory. So we have three possibilities. 1. Germany sank the Titanic as part of pre-war preparations, then covered it up to avoid premature conflict. 2. Someone else sank it and framed Germany to create a future pretext for war. 3. It was sunk for reasons unrelated to World War I, economic, personal, or political motivations we haven't uncovered yet. Any of which would explain why powerful interests have kept this secret for 73 years, Chen added. Whether it was Germany, Britain, America, or some other actor, revealing the truth would expose a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. It would rewrite our understanding of the events leading to World War I. It could destabilize current international relationships. People in power don't want that kind of chaos. The storm raged on through that second day and into the third. I continued reviewing evidence, building timelines, developing theories. The other agents coordinated with their respective agencies, sending encrypted reports and receiving updates on the developing situation. Because this had become much more than a historical investigation, it was now an active intelligence operation with international implications. On the morning of the third day, as the storm finally began to show signs of breaking, something happened that changed everything again. I was in the operations center, working through passenger manifests and trying to identify potential targets among the Titanic's passengers, when our communications officer burst through the door, his face pale. "Agent Whitmore, we have an emergency transmission. It's coming from a Russian submarine, and they're asking to speak with you specifically." "A Russian submarine? How close are they?" "Very close. They surfaced about 2 miles from our position. They're requesting permission to send a representative aboard the Nor to discuss matters of mutual interest." Those were their exact words, matters of mutual interest. I exchanged glances with Chen and Morrison. Russian submarines didn't just appear out of nowhere and ask for meetings. This was either an extraordinary intelligence opportunity or a trap. "What's their identification?" I asked. "They identify as the research submarine Mir-1, operating under the auspices of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. But Agent Whitmore, research submarines don't typically operate in this area, and they definitely don't carry the kind of equipment our radar is detecting. This is a military vessel pretending to be a research ship. Can you get Deputy Director Harrison on the line?" "Already tried. The storm is interfering with our satellite communications. We're on our own for decision-making until the weather clears." I thought quickly. Meeting with Russian intelligence officers aboard an American research vessel in the middle of the Atlantic was irregular at best, potentially disastrous at worst. But if they had information about the Titanic investigation, if they knew something about what we'd found, "Tell them their representative can come aboard, but only one person and they submit to a security search. We'll meet in the main conference room with full security present, and make it clear that any hostile action will be met with force." 20 minutes later, a Russian officer was being escorted into the conference room by 3 armed Coast Guard personnel who'd been providing security for the expedition. He was a man in his 50s, weathered and professional, wearing a Soviet Navy uniform without insignia. He nodded politely to me and the other agents as he entered. "Agent Whitmore, I presume. I am Captain Volkov. I apologize for the dramatic introduction, but circumstances require urgency. We have been monitoring your investigation, and we have information you need to hear before you proceed further. You've been spying on us, I said bluntly. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. Just as you spy on us. This is the nature of our relationship. But today, I am not here as a spy. I am here as someone who knows the truth about the Titanic and believes that truth should finally be revealed. You're saying the Soviets know what happened to the Titanic? Not the Soviets, the Russians. This goes back to the Tsarist era before the revolution. In 1912, Russian intelligence was very interested in certain activities by the German Empire. We were aware of a secret submarine development program that your Western intelligence agencies apparently missed or ignored. And we knew about a planned operation against Western shipping interests. He pulled a waterproof envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. I am authorized to share certain historical documents with you, documents from the archives of the Russian Empire that detail what we knew about German plans in early 1912. I am sharing this information because my government believes it is time for the truth to emerge, and because there are forces currently working to prevent you from completing this investigation. What kind of forces? Morrison asked. The same forces that sank the Titanic and have covered it up for 73 years. They know you found the wreck. They know what you've discovered. And they are preparing to ensure you never recover the evidence you need to prove what happened. Who? I demanded. Who are you talking about? Volkov's expression was grim. That is more complicated than you might think. The operation to sink the Titanic involved multiple parties with different motivations. German military intelligence provided the submarine and the expertise. British intelligence knew about the plan and allowed it to proceed because it served their interests. American financial interests helped fund the operation because they stood to profit from the insurance claims and the elimination of certain business rivals who were aboard the ship. The room was silent, except for the howl of the diminishing storm outside. What Volkov was describing wasn't a simple case of sabotage. It was a vast conspiracy involving multiple governments and private interests. You're saying Britain and America were complicit in the murder of 1,500 people? Chen asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Not the governments as such. Specific individuals within those governments and in positions of power outside government. The conspiracy was compartmented. Most participants knew only their piece of the operation. Only a few individuals understood the full scope of what was being done and why. And why? I asked. Why would anyone do this? Why? Volkov opened the envelope and spread several aged documents across the table. They were in Russian, but he'd brought translations. Money, power, control. 3 of the wealthiest men in America were aboard the Titanic, men who opposed the creation of a central banking system that other financial interests wanted to establish. Remove those 3 men, and the opposition to the Federal Reserve collapsed. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, less than a year after the Titanic sank. Coincidence? I felt sick. You're saying 1,500 people died so that bankers could create the Federal Reserve? I am saying that was one motivation among several. The German military wanted to test their new submarine capabilities. The British wanted evidence of German aggression they could use diplomatically. Various financial interests wanted to eliminate rivals and profit from insurance fraud. All these motivations aligned in April 1912, and the Titanic became the target of a coordinated operation that served multiple purposes. Rodriguez was reading through the translated documents. These describe meetings between German, British, and American intelligence officers in 1911 and early 1912. They discuss the Atlantic Project and the elimination of commercial obstacles, but they don't explicitly mention the Titanic. Of course not, Volkov said. The operation was deniable by design. If it had been exposed, everyone involved could claim they were working on something else entirely. The beauty of the plan was that it looked like an accident. The Iceberg story was perfect, plausible, tragic, but ultimately just bad luck and human error. No one to blame except the forces of nature. But Russian intelligence knew the truth, I said. We suspected the truth. We had fragments of information that suggested something larger was happening. But we couldn't prove it, and we couldn't act on it without triggering a diplomatic crisis. So the information was filed away in our archives, classified at the highest levels, preserved but never acted upon. Until now, Morrison said. Why now? Why, after 73 years, are you suddenly willing to share this information? Volkov smiled slightly. Because the world has changed. The Cold War is thawing. Glasnost and perestroika mean greater openness. And because my government calculates that revealing the truth about the Titanic will damage Western interests more than Russian interests. We were not involved in the conspiracy. We were merely observers. You were the perpetrators, or at least your predecessors were. The moral stain is on the West, not on us. That's a hell of a propaganda victory, Chen muttered. Yes, Volkov agreed, but it is also the truth, and truth has value beyond propaganda. Those 1,500 people deserve to have their story told accurately. The conspiracy that killed them deserves to be exposed. Justice, even 73 years late, is still justice. I studied the Russian captain, trying to determine if he was being genuine or if this was an elaborate disinformation operation. His story aligned with much of what we'd discovered independently, but it was almost too convenient, too perfectly suited to Soviet propaganda purposes. You said there are forces working to stop our investigation, I said. What forces? What should we be watching for? The same intelligence networks that orchestrated the original operation still exist, though in evolved form. British intelligence, American intelligence agencies, private military contractors with ties to financial interests, they all have reasons to want this covered up. Some out of institutional loyalty to protect secrets. Some because current political leaders are descended from or connected to the original conspirators. Some simply because chaos and instability are bad for business. You're describing a shadow government, Rodriguez said. A conspiracy within multiple governments that has operated continuously for 73 years. I am describing reality, Volkov corrected. Not shadow government, simply the way power actually works, as opposed to how your civics textbooks say it works. The people who truly control policy, who make the decisions that matter, are not always the elected officials. They are the intelligence officers, the military leaders, the financiers, the corporate executives who have maintained power across multiple administrations and multiple generations. He stood up, preparing to leave. I have given you the documents. I have warned you about the opposition you face. What you do with this information is your choice. But I urge you to act quickly. Every hour you delay gives them more time to organize a response. They know where you are. They know what you're planning. And they will stop you if they can. One more question, I said as he reached the door. The submarine we found in the debris field. The one with technology that shouldn't have existed in 1912. Was that German? Volkov paused, his hand on the door. Yes, it was built in secret, using technology stolen from various sources and accelerated by brilliant engineering. Only 3 were ever built, and all 3 were destroyed to prevent their existence from being revealed. The one in your debris field was scuttled after the operation to ensure it couldn't be recovered and examined. Until now, I said. Until now, he agreed, which is why you must move quickly. They failed to keep you from finding the wreck. They will not fail to prevent you from recovering the evidence. After Volkov left, escorted back to his submarine by our security team, the 4 of us sat in silence for several minutes, processing what we'd just learned. Do we believe him? Morrison finally asked. The documents look authentic, Rodriguez said. I'll need to have them analyzed by experts, but the paper is the right age, the ink is consistent with period documents, and the Russian government seals appear genuine. But that doesn't mean the content is true, Chen pointed out. The Soviets could have created false documents decades ago, kept them in reserve for an opportunity like this. This could be a brilliant disinformation operation designed to damage Western alliances. Or it could be the truth, I said, a truth that aligns with the physical evidence we've found on the wreck. The explosives damage, the torpedo, the advanced submarine, all of it supports Volkov's story. I'm not ready to dismiss it just because it comes from the Russians. So what do we do? Morrison asked. I looked out the window at the slowly calming seas. The storm was breaking up, patches of blue sky appearing between the clouds. Within 24 hours, we'd be able to launch the submersible and attempt to recover the torpedo. We proceed with the recovery operation, I decided. We get that torpedo to the surface. We document everything we can about the advanced submarine. We gather enough physical evidence to prove beyond doubt that the Titanic was sabotaged. And then we take that evidence to the highest levels of our government and let them decide what to do with it. And if Volkov is right, Rodriguez asked, if there are forces within our own government trying to stop us, then we go public, I said. We give the evidence to the media, to congressional oversight committees, to anyone who will listen. We make it impossible to cover up. Chen shook his head. That could end all our careers. You know that, right? Whistleblowers don't get treated well even when they're right, especially when they expose secrets this sensitive. I know, I acknowledged, but sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences. Those 1/500 people on the Titanic didn't get a choice. They were murdered for financial and political gain, and then their deaths were covered up for 73 years. The least we can do is give them justice, even if it costs us our careers. The other agents nodded slowly. We were committed now, committed to seeing this through regardless of personal cost. But what none of us knew yet was just how high that cost would be, or how far the conspiracy would go to protect itself. The next 24 hours would test everything we believed about duty, honor, and truth. And by the end of it, at least one of us wouldn't survive to see the investigation completed. Chapter 4. The Recovery Operation. The morning of September 16th dawned clear and cold, the storm finally exhausted after 3 days of battering the Nore. The seas had calmed to a gentle swell, the wind had dropped to less than 10 knots, and the weather forecast showed a window of at least 12 hours of optimal conditions, perfect for attempting the deep submersible operation to recover the torpedo. Dr. Ballard and his team had spent the night preparing Alvin, the deep-sea submersible that would carry 2 people down to the Titanic wreck site. The vessel was a marvel of engineering, a titanium sphere that could withstand the crushing pressure at 12,500 feet, equipped with cameras, mechanical arms for manipulating objects, and life support systems that could keep its occupants alive for up to 72 hours in an emergency. "We're ready whenever you are," Ballard told me as I stood on deck watching the preparations. "I'll be piloting, and I'd recommend bringing Agent Chen with us. He has naval ordnance experience that could be useful if we encounter any complications with the torpedo." "Agreed. Chen, you good to go?" Agent Chen nodded, though I could see the nervousness in his eyes. Nobody takes a 12,500-foot descent into the Atlantic lightly. If anything went wrong down there, if the submersible's hull failed, if we got tangled in wreckage, if our life support malfunctioned, we'd die within seconds, crushed by pressure or drowned in the dark. "Equipment check," Ballard called out to his team. "Let's verify everything one more time before we commit to this." While the technical team went through their checklists, I gathered Morrison and Rodriguez for a final briefing. "If something happens down there, if we don't come back, you need to take what we've learned and run with it. Get the evidence to Washington. Make sure the truth comes out." "Nothing's going to happen," Morrison said, but his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "Probably not," I agreed, but Captain Volkov's warning keeps playing in my mind. If there really are forces trying to stop this investigation, the recovery operation is their best opportunity. We're vulnerable down there, out of communication, dependent entirely on this ship for support. It would be relatively easy to sabotage the submersible or cut our umbilical connection. "We've got security watching everything," Rodriguez assured me. "Coast Guard personnel are guarding the submersible and the launch equipment. Nobody's getting near it without authorization." "Just be careful," I said. "Trust no one outside our immediate team. If anything seems off, abort everything and get us to the surface." At overweight 15, Chen and I climbed into Alvin's cramped interior. The sphere was barely 6 feet in diameter, just enough room for 3 people and the essential equipment. It smelled of metal and electronics, with a faint undertone of previous occupants' sweat. There were 3 small portholes, thick acrylic windows that would give us limited visibility once we reached the wreck. Ballard squeezed in after us, settling into the pilot's position with practiced ease. "Comfortable?" he asked with wry humor. "Not even remotely," I replied, trying to find a position for my legs that didn't cramp immediately. "Good. Means you're paying attention." Ballard began flipping switches and checking instruments. "All right, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to descend 2.5 miles to visit a ship that's been dead for 73 years. Try not to think about all the ways this could go wrong." "Thanks for that," Chen muttered. The hatch was sealed from outside, the metallic clang echoing in our tiny sphere. For a moment, we were completely enclosed, dependent entirely on our equipment and Ballard's skill. Then the launch crane lifted us off the deck and swung us out over the water. "Nor control. This is Alvin. We're ready for water entry," Ballard spoke into the radio. "Copy that, Alvin. You're clear for launch. Good hunting down there." The sphere touched the water, bobbed for a moment, then began to sink as Ballard flooded the ballast tanks. Through the porthole, I watched the surface recede above us, the bright morning light fading to blue-green, then deeper blue, then a twilight dimness as we descended. "We're passing through 100 feet, Ballard announced. "Everything nominal. Starting timer now. We have 4 hours of bottom time maximum. Then we need to start ascent, regardless of mission status. 4 hours, 2.5 miles down, plus time to locate the torpedo, secure it for recovery, and return to the surface. It would be tight." The descent took 90 minutes. 90 minutes of watching the light fade to complete darkness, of feeling the temperature drop as we sank deeper, of listening to the occasional creak and groan of the pressure sphere adjusting to the increasing pressure. Outside, we passed through different layers of the ocean, the sunlit surface zone, the twilight zone where the last traces of light disappeared, and finally into the midnight zone where no light penetrated except what we brought with us. At 2,000 feet, we passed through a layer of bioluminescent jellyfish, their bodies pulsing with ghostly blue-green light as they drifted in the current. At 5,000 feet, we saw a sperm whale, its massive body gliding past us in the darkness, as alien and magnificent as any creature could be. And then, at 2,500 feet, the bottom appeared in our lights. "There," Ballard said, pointing through the porthole. "That's the bow section." Rising out of the darkness like a ghost ship, the Titanic's bow loomed before us. Even after 73 years underwater, it was magnificent and terrible. The railings where passengers had stood on that final night, the anchor chains that had once held her in port, the bridge where Captain Smith had commanded his ship until the very end. "Jesus," Chen whispered. "It's really there." We spent several minutes just hovering in front of the bow, taking in the sheer scale of the wreck. Then Ballard maneuvered us around to the starboard side, following the hull toward the area where the torpedo had been spotted in the debris field. "Watch for the blast damage," I said. "I want to document those holes again with our cameras." As we moved along the hull, I could see what the remote cameras had captured, the circular breaches in the steel plating, too regular and precise to be natural damage. This close, with our powerful lights illuminating the metal, the evidence of explosives was unmistakable. Someone had planted charges against the inside of the hull in locations calculated to cause maximum flooding. "I'm recording everything," Ballard confirmed. "This footage will be definitive proof of sabotage." We continued past the bow section into the debris field. The ocean floor here was littered with objects from the ship: deck chairs, dishes, bottles, luggage, personal belongings scattered across the sediment like a museum that had been dropped from the sky. And among it all, the heavier pieces of ship structure, metal fixtures, mechanical equipment. "There," Chen said suddenly, pointing. "Is that it?" About 50 feet ahead, partially buried in the sediment, was the cylindrical object we'd seen in the earlier footage. Up close, there was no doubt what it was: a torpedo, corroded and covered in marine growth, but unmistakably a weapon. Ballard maneuvered Alvin carefully closer, positioning us so the mechanical arm could reach the torpedo. "Agent Whitmore, you're the investigator. How do you want to do this?" "Document everything first. Get clear footage from multiple angles. Then we'll secure a cable to it so the surface crew can winch it up once we're clear." For the next 20 minutes, we systematically photographed and filmed the torpedo from every angle, measuring its dimensions, documenting its position relative to other debris, building a complete forensic record. Chen was identifying features that confirmed it was indeed a German G6 torpedo, manufactured sometime between 1906 and 1912. "This is incredible," Chen said. "The design details match German specifications exactly. But look at this modification on the propulsion system. Someone upgraded it, improved the range and depth capability. This isn't standard military issue. This is a custom weapon built for a specific operation. Can you tell when it was manufactured?" The serial numbers are too corroded to read, but based on the design features, I'd say it was built no earlier than 1910 and no later than 1912. The modifications suggest it was built specifically for deep-water operations, which would make sense if they were planning to use it in the mid-Atlantic. Ballard carefully extended Alvin's mechanical arm, gripping the torpedo with the claw-like manipulator. I'm going to attach the recovery cable now. This needs to be done carefully. The metal is fragile after so many years underwater. If it breaks apart, we might not be able to recover the pieces. With agonizing slowness, he maneuvered the cable's hook around the torpedo and secured it. Got it. Knorr, this is Alvin. We've secured the primary target. Ready for recovery winch when we give the signal. Copy that, Alvin. Standing by. Now, I said, let's find that submarine Volkov mentioned. If we can document advanced technology from 1912, that corroborates everything. Ballard consulted his navigation instruments. Based on the earlier survey data, it should be about a quarter-mile southwest of our current position, but we're already 45 minutes into our bottom time. We need to be mindful of our limits. I understand, but we may not get another chance at this. Let's at least locate it and get some documentation. We left the torpedo secured for recovery and headed southwest across the debris field. The trip took 15 minutes of careful navigation around obstacles and wreckage, and then, rising out of the sediment like a prehistoric sea creature, we found it. The submarine was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Smaller than modern submarines, maybe 60 feet long, but the design was decades ahead of what should have existed in 1912. The hull was streamlined, hydrodynamic. The conning tower was reinforced in ways that suggested it was built for deep diving. And most remarkably, there were external pods that looked like they might have housed advanced batteries or propulsion systems. That shouldn't exist, Ballard said flatly. Agent Whitmore, I've studied the history of submarine development extensively. Nothing like this was built in 1912. The technology shouldn't have been available. Unless someone had technology that wasn't in the public record, Chen suggested. Secret development programs, stolen designs, accelerated innovation driven by military necessity. It's possible. I was filming everything, knowing this evidence would be crucial. Can you see any identification? Any markings that would tell us who built it? Ballard maneuvered closer to the hull. There, near the conning tower. It's heavily corroded, but I can make out what looks like German naval insignia. And there's a designation number, but I can only read part of it. U something. The rest is obscured. U-boat, Chen said. It's definitely German. We spent another 20 minutes documenting the submarine, filming it from every angle, recording its features and specifications. But time was running out. We need to start ascent, Ballard said reluctantly. We're at 3 hours and 10 minutes of bottom time. If we don't leave now, we risk not having enough power reserve for a safe ascent. Agreed. Let's get back to the surface. We've got what we came for. The ascent was supposed to be routine, a controlled rise back to the surface, with the torpedo being winched up separately on its cable. But at 8,000 feet, something went wrong. Knorr, this is Alvin. We're experiencing unusual resistance in our ascent. It feels like we're being pulled down. Ballard spoke into the radio, his voice tight with concern. The response was immediate but troubling. Alvin, be advised we're detecting another vessel in the area. Submarine signature, unknown nationality. It appears to be maneuvering near your position. Can you identify it? Negative. It's running silent, no identification transponder. But it's definitely there, and it's between you and the surface. Chen and I exchanged glances. Captain Volkov had warned us. Someone was trying to stop us. Nor, what about the torpedo recovery cable? There was a pause. Alvin, the cable has been cut. The torpedo is falling back to the bottom. Repeat, recovery operation has been sabotaged. Someone cut your cable. I felt cold fury building. We'd come so close. We'd found the evidence, documented it, secured it for recovery, and now someone had deliberately destroyed it. Who cut the cable? I demanded over the radio. Unknown. It happened during a shift change in the launch crew. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. Inside job, Chen said grimly. Someone aboard the Knorr is working against us. Alvin, you need to get to the surface immediately. Morrison's voice came through the radio. We have reason to believe there may be additional sabotage attempts. Rodriguez is securing the launch area with Coast Guard personnel. We're treating this as a hostile action. Copy that, Ballard replied, his hands working the controls. But we've got a problem. The unidentified submarine is releasing something in the water. Our sensors are showing multiple small objects being deployed. What kind of objects? I asked. I don't know, but they're moving toward us. Fast. Through the porthole, I could see lights in the darkness. Small, bright points approaching from below. Not bioluminescent sea life. Something mechanical. They're drones, Chen said with certainty. Underwater drones, probably equipped with cutting tools or explosives. They're trying to disable us before we can surface. Ballard's hands flew across the controls, maneuvering Alvin with desperate skill. We began rising faster, pushing the submersible to its limits. The drones pursued, their lights growing brighter as they closed the distance. Knorr, we are being attacked by underwater drones. Need immediate assistance. Alvin, the Russian submarine Mir 1 has surfaced and is requesting permission to intervene. They claim they can destroy the hostile drones. Captain Volkov, coming to our rescue again. But could we trust him? Did we have a choice? Tell them yes, I ordered. Tell them to stop those drones before they reach us. Through the porthole, I saw new lights appear. Larger, more powerful. The Russian submarine had deployed its own drones, and they were moving to intercept the attackers. In the darkness of the deep ocean, a battle was being fought with machines, a conflict between forces I didn't fully understand. One of the hostile drones exploded, its lights winking out instantly. Then another. The Russian drones were neutralizing the threat, buying us time to escape. Keep rising, I told Ballard. Don't stop for anything. We continued our ascent, the pressure decreasing as we rose, the temperature gradually warming. At 3,000 feet, the last of the hostile drones was destroyed, its wreckage sinking back into the depths. At 1,000 feet, we could see daylight filtering down from above. Beautiful, life-giving sunlight that meant we were almost safe. And then, at 500 feet, we broke through into the sunlit zone, the water around us changing from black to blue to crystalline green. Above us, I could see the hull of the Knorr and another vessel I didn't recognize, probably the hostile submarine that had tried to kill us. Knorr, Alvin is at 500 feet and rising. We're going to surface approximately 200 yards from your position. Copy that, Alvin. Coast Guard is deploying to secure you once you surface. And be advised, the hostile submarine is diving and departing the area at high speed. The Russian vessel is maintaining position. We broke the surface into bright sunshine, the sphere bobbing on the gentle swells. Through the porthole, I could see the Knorr moving toward us, and farther away, the distinctive shape of a surfaced submarine flying the Russian flag. The hatch was opened from outside, and fresh air rushed in, the most welcome sensation I'd ever experienced. We climbed out onto Alvin's exterior platform, where a launch boat from the Knorr picked us up and transported us back to the ship. As we climbed aboard, Morrison and Rodriguez were waiting with grim expressions. The torpedo is gone, Morrison said without preamble. It fell back to 2,500 feet when they cut the cable. It's probably buried in the sediment by now. Recovering it would take another operation, and we might not be able to find it again. What about the footage? I demanded. Please tell me the cameras recorded everything. They did, Rodriguez confirmed. We have complete documentation of both the torpedo and the advanced submarine. The footage is being transmitted to Washington now on encrypted channels. And the saboteur? Morrison's expression darkened. We've identified him. One of the technical crew, a man named Fisher. German heritage, though he's been an American citizen for 20 years. He claims he was following orders from his real employer, a private security contractor with ties to German intelligence. Where is he now? In custody in the ship's brig. Coast Guard has him secured. But Agent Whitmore, this changes everything. If German intelligence is actively working to stop this investigation, if they're willing to commit acts of war, because that's what attacking a U.S. government vessel in international waters amounts to, then this is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about covering up history. This is about preventing a truth that could reshape current international relations. I looked out across the water at the Russian submarine. Captain Volkov had saved our lives twice now. But why? What did Russia gain from helping us? As if in answer to my thoughts, a signal lamp began flashing from the Mir 1. Morrison had a junior officer translate the Morse code. Truth serves all who seek it. Be careful, Agent Whitmore. The wolves are circling. What does he mean? Chen asked. He means, I said slowly, that we've stirred up something very dangerous. The people who sank the Titanic and covered it up for 73 years, they're still out there. They're still powerful, and they're not going to let us expose them without a fight. We've just survived one attack. There will be others. So what do we do? Rodriguez asked. I thought about the evidence we'd gathered. The footage of the torpedo and the submarine, the testimony from Captain Volkov, the documents from Russian archives. We had enough to prove the Titanic had been sabotaged. We had enough to show a conspiracy. But would it be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against us? We do what we came here to do, I decided. We get this evidence to Washington. We brief the president. We make damn sure that even if they kill us, the truth gets out. Those 1,500 people deserve justice, even if we have to die to give it to them. The other agents nodded grimly. We were committed now, past the point of no return. The investigation had become a war, and we were on the front lines whether we'd chosen to be or not. The Titanic's secrets were finally emerging from the deep, and the world was about to learn that sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't solved. They're suppressed, hidden, protected by people who have everything to lose if the truth comes out. But not this time. Not if I had anything to say about it. We reached Washington, D.C. 36 hours after the attack, traveling via Coast Guard helicopter to Halifax, then military transport to Andrews Air Force Base. Deputy Director Harrison met us on the tarmac, his face grim. The president wants to see you immediately, he said without preamble. The footage you transmitted has caused a firestorm. Half the National Security Council wants to bury this forever. The other half wants to expose it immediately. You're about to walk into a political hurricane. The debriefing took place in a secure conference room deep beneath the White House, a facility I'd heard about but never expected to see. The Situation Room's more classified cousin. The president was there, along with the heads of the CIA, FBI, NSA, and the Secretaries of State and Defense. Also present were several people I didn't recognize, probably members of the intelligence community's most classified divisions. I presented our findings methodically, walking them through everything we'd discovered. The hull damage patterns consistent with internal explosive. The German torpedo found in the debris field. The advanced submarine that shouldn't have existed in 1912, the documents provided by Captain Volkov detailing the conspiracy, the attempts to sabotage our investigation and kill us during the recovery operation. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the president spoke. Agent Whitmore, are you absolutely certain about these findings? You're telling me that one of the most famous disasters in American history was actually a mass murder, and that elements of multiple governments, including potentially our own, were complicit in covering it up for 73 years. Mr. President, I'm certain about the physical evidence. The footage doesn't lie. Someone placed explosives inside the Titanic. There was a German military submarine in the area using technology that officially didn't exist yet, and someone is willing to kill to keep this information from becoming public. Those are facts, not speculation. The CIA director leaned forward. The Russian documents could be disinformation. Captain Volkov could be running an operation designed to damage Western alliances by creating distrust between the U.S. and Germany. That's possible, I acknowledged. But the physical evidence supports his story. The torpedo is German. The submarine is German. The explosives damage is real. Even if Volkov's documents are false, the core truth remains. The Titanic was deliberately destroyed. By whom? The Secretary of State demanded. If we're going to accuse Germany, we need absolute proof. Our relationship with them is foundational to NATO, to European security, to the entire post-war order. Destroying that relationship based on incomplete evidence would be catastrophic. Agent Chen spoke up. Madam Secretary, we're not accusing modern Germany of anything. We're documenting what happened in 1912, before World War I, before the current German government existed. This is historical truth, not a contemporary accusation. Historical truth with contemporary consequences, she shot back. Do you have any idea what happens if we publicly state that Germany sank the Titanic? That they murdered 1,500 people, including hundreds of Americans? The political fallout would be immense. Anti-German sentiment would explode. Trade relationships would be damaged. The entire European economic system could be destabilized. The president held up his hand for silence. Let's be clear about what we're really discussing here. We have evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so carefully concealed that it's survived nearly 3/4 of a century. The question before us isn't whether the Titanic was sabotaged. The evidence Agent Whitmore has provided makes that clear. The question is what we do with that information. He turned to me directly. Agent Whitmore, you're a field investigator. You find the truth and present it to your superiors. But now you're in a room full of people whose job is to manage truth, to decide when it serves national interests to reveal it, and when it serves those interests to keep it classified. I need you to understand the stakes here. If we expose this conspiracy, we're not just rewriting history. We're potentially destabilizing current geopolitics, damaging critical alliances, and opening questions about what else governments have been hiding. Are you prepared for those consequences? I thought about the 1,500 people who died in the freezing Atlantic waters. I thought about the families who'd spent 73 years believing their loved ones had died in a tragic accident. I thought about the generations of historians who'd studied the Titanic without knowing they were studying a crime scene. Mr. President, with respect, I don't think the truth should be a matter of political calculation. Those people deserve to have their story told accurately. The world deserves to know what really happened. If there are consequences to that revelation, then we deal with those consequences. But we can't base our decision on what's politically convenient. The president smiled slightly. That's the answer I was hoping for, even if it's not the answer that makes my job easier. He looked around the room. Here's what we're going to do. The evidence will be preserved and classified at the highest levels. A full investigation will be conducted quietly to determine the extent of the conspiracy and identify any surviving participants or institutional connections. Agent Whitmore and his team will lead that investigation with full authority and all necessary resources. And public disclosure? The Secretary of State asked. We'll release a carefully worded statement acknowledging that new evidence suggests the Titanic disaster may have been more complex than previously understood. We'll announce that a comprehensive review is underway. We will not make accusations against any nation or organization until we have complete proof. And we will coordinate with our allies, including Germany, to ensure this revelation doesn't damage critical relationships. That's a cover-up, I said bluntly. A softer version than what's been happening for 73 years, but still a cover-up. No, the president corrected. It's responsible governance. It's the difference between revealing truth in a way that serves justice and revealing it in a way that causes chaos. You'll get your investigation, Agent Whitmore. You'll get the resources to find every piece of the puzzle. But we're going to do this carefully, methodically, and with consideration for the broader implications. Is that acceptable? I looked at Chen, Morrison, and Rodriguez. They nodded slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than we'd expected. Yes, Mr. President, that's acceptable. Good. You have 6 months to complete your investigation. At the end of that period, we'll make a final determination about public disclosure based on what you've found. Director Harrison will coordinate resources and support. Gentleman, lady, you're dismissed. Except you, Agent Whitmore. I'd like a word in private. After the others filed out, the president gestured for me to sit. You know why I kept you back? No, sir. Because I wanted to tell you something off the record, something you need to hear. He leaned forward, his expression serious. My grandfather was supposed to be on the Titanic. He was a banker, one of the men opposed to creating the Federal Reserve. He canceled his passage 3 days before the ship sailed, citing business complications. He never talked about why he canceled, and he died when I was young. But I've always wondered if he knew something, if he was warned. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think someone warned certain people to save them before the attack? I think the conspiracy may have been even more complex than we've discovered. I think there were participants at every level. Some who planned the attack, some who facilitated it, some who knew enough to protect themselves or others. My grandfather might have been one of those people, which means my family might have been complicit, even if only through silence. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that I understand what you're up against. The conspiracy doesn't just involve dead Germans and historical figures. It involves families, institutions, structures of power that exist today. Some of the people who benefited from the Titanic's destruction, their descendants are in positions of influence now. They won't want you to expose their family secrets. Are you warning me or threatening me, Mr. President? He smiled sadly. Warning you, and telling you that you have my support, even if that support has to remain unofficial. Find the truth, Agent Whitmore. All of it, even the parts that implicate my family or other powerful people. The dead deserve that much. After I left the White House, I met with my team at a secure FBI facility in Virginia. We spent the next 18 hours going through everything we knew, building timelines, identifying gaps in our evidence, planning the next phase of the investigation. We need to find survivors, Morrison said. People who were aboard the Titanic and are still alive. There can't be many left, but if we can find even one or two who remember things that didn't fit the official narrative. The last survivor died in 2009, Rodriguez said, checking her notes. But there might be children of survivors, people who heard stories that were never made public, family secrets passed down through generations. And we need to trace the financial trail, Chen added. Follow the insurance money, the business deals that happened after the sinking, the people who profited from it. Money leaves traces even after 73 years. I nodded. We also need to find out who's been protecting this secret. Someone cut our recovery cable. Someone deployed those drones to attack us. Those weren't random acts. They were coordinated operations by people with significant resources. We need to identify them and stop them before they try again. Over the next 6 months, we conducted what became the most extensive investigation in FBI history. We traveled to 12 countries, interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed thousands of documents, and slowly pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy. What we found was both more and less than we'd expected. Yes, Germany had developed advanced submarine technology in secret before World War I. Yes, they had targeted the Titanic as part of a broader strategy to disrupt Western economic power. But they hadn't acted alone. British intelligence had known about the plan and allowed it to proceed because they saw it as an opportunity to create a future pretext for war. American financial interests had provided funding and intelligence support because they wanted to eliminate opposition to the Federal Reserve. And various other actors, from private military contractors to rival shipping companies, had participated for their own reasons. The conspiracy wasn't a unified plot. It was a convergence of interests, multiple parties pursuing different objectives that happened to align on one terrible night in April 1912. The beauty of it, from the conspirators' perspective, was that no single party knew the full scope of what the others were doing. The operation was compartmented, deniable, and nearly impossible to trace. We identified 17 people who were still alive and had some connection to the original conspiracy, descendants of participants, employees of companies that had been involved, former intelligence officers who'd helped maintain the cover-up. Most cooperated once they realized we had evidence. A few resisted and had to be compelled through legal means, and we found the iceberg. That was perhaps the strangest discovery of all. There had been an iceberg, a real one, in the area that night, but it hadn't sunk the Titanic. Instead, the conspirators had used explosives to break off large chunks of ice and scatter them on the ship's deck, creating the appearance of a collision. The actual iceberg had drifted past harmlessly while the real damage was being done by internal charges below the waterline. The elegance of the deception was remarkable. In the chaos of the sinking, with people panicking and the ship going down, no one had questioned the ice on the deck. It was proof of the collision, physical evidence that supported the official narrative. But it had all been staged, a massive piece of theater designed to hide mass murder. 6 months after our briefing at the White House, we delivered our final report. 5,000 pages of evidence, testimony, analysis, and recommendations. We documented everything: who, what, when, where, why, and how. The truth about the Titanic, complete and undeniable. The president read our report over a weekend at Camp David. On Monday, he called me to the White House again. This is extraordinary work, Agent Whitmore. The level of detail, the thoroughness of your investigation, it's remarkable. You've proven beyond any doubt that the Titanic was deliberately destroyed and that the cover-up involved multiple governments and institutions. Thank you, Mr. President. So when do we go public? He was quiet for a moment. We don't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I felt anger rising. Sir, you promised... I promised you'd get to conduct a full investigation. You did. I never promised we'd release the findings. Agent Whitmore, I've read this report 3 times. I've consulted with experts in international relations, economics, intelligence, and history. The consensus is unanimous. Releasing this information would cause more harm than good. Harm to whom? The people who were complicit? Harm to everyone. The dollar's stability depends partly on international confidence in American institutions. That confidence would be shaken if we admitted our government helped murder 1,500 people for financial gain. Our alliance with Germany is crucial to global security. That alliance would be damaged if we accused them, even historically, of terrorism. The entire post-war international order is built on certain assumptions about history and trust. This revelation would undermine those foundations. So we just bury the truth forever? Let those 1,500 people stay forgotten, their murders unavenged? No. We classify the information at the highest levels and preserve it for future release when the geopolitical situation allows. Maybe in 25 years, maybe 50. But someday when the world is more stable, when the relationships that could be damaged no longer exist, then the truth can come out. I stood up. Then I resign. If this is how truth is treated, if justice is just a political calculation, I want no part of it. The president nodded slowly. I expected you might say that. I'm sorry, Agent Whitmore. You're a good investigator and a man of principle. Those principles are going to cost you your career. I can live with that. Can you live with covering up mass murder? I'll have to. It's the job. I left the White House that day and never went back. I submitted my resignation to the FBI, effective immediately. Chen, Morrison, and Rodriguez all did the same. We couldn't be part of an organization that would bury truth for political convenience. But we didn't stay silent. We couldn't release the classified information. That would have been illegal and would have landed us in prison. But we could talk about the investigation in general terms. We could write articles and give lectures about historical cover-ups. We could keep the questions alive, even if we couldn't provide all the answers. And we made sure copies of the evidence were preserved outside government control, hidden in safe deposit boxes with trusted lawyers in locations the government didn't know about. Insurance, in case something happened to us. If we died under suspicious circumstances, the information would be released automatically. Years passed. The official story of the Titanic remained unchanged in the public consciousness. A tragic accident, a cautionary tale about hubris and ice. But gradually, slowly, questions began to emerge. Researchers started noticing inconsistencies in the historical record. Witnesses' stories that didn't quite match the official narrative. Financial transactions that suggested foreknowledge of the disaster. The truth was leaking out, drop by drop, piece by piece. Not the full revelation we'd wanted, but enough to plant doubt, to make people wonder if the story they'd been told was complete. In 2012, on the 100th anniversary of the sinking, I was invited to speak at a Titanic commemoration event in New York. I was 72 years old by then, retired from the FBI for more than 2 decades, but people still remembered my involvement in the 1985 investigation. I stood before an audience of historians, survivors' descendants, and Titanic enthusiasts, and I told them a truth that had been classified for 27 years. The Titanic did not sink because it hit an iceberg. It sank because powerful people wanted it to sink, and they were willing to murder 1,500 innocent souls to achieve their objectives. I know this because I investigated it, I documented it, I proved it beyond any doubt, and I was ordered to keep it secret because revealing the truth would be politically inconvenient. The room erupted. People demanded to see the evidence. Media outlets tried to interview me. The government issued statements denying my claims and suggesting I was suffering from age-related delusions. But I stood by my words, and so did Chen, Morrison, and Rodriguez, who joined me on stage. We couldn't release the classified documents, but we could tell our story. We could testify to what we'd seen with our own eyes at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and we could challenge the official narrative in ways that made it impossible to ignore. The controversy raged for months. Congressional hearings were held. Freedom of information requests were filed. Pressure mounted for the government to declassify the investigation files. And finally, grudgingly, they did. Not all of it. Many documents remained classified for national security reasons, but enough was released to prove we'd been telling the truth. The explosive damage to the hull, the German torpedo, the advanced submarine, the evidence of conspiracy. The world's understanding of the Titanic changed overnight. It was no longer just a tragic accident. It was a crime scene, one of the greatest unsolved murders in history. Books were written, documentaries were made. The victims were finally recognized not as people who died in an unfortunate disaster, but as people who'd been murdered for political and economic gain. It wasn't the complete revelation I'd wanted back in 1985, but it was truth, partial and delayed, but truth nonetheless. The victims had their justice, even if it came more than a century late. I'm 94 years old now, writing this in 2037. Most of the people involved in the original conspiracy are long dead. The governments and institutions that covered it up have transformed or disappeared. The geopolitical concerns that prevented full disclosure in 1985 no longer exist. But the lesson remains. Powerful people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets. They will kill, they will lie, and they will suppress truth for decades if it serves their interests. The only defense against that is people who refuse to stay silent, who value truth over convenience, who understand that justice delayed is still worth pursuing. The Titanic was never found. Not really. What we found was evidence of a crime. The ship itself, the floating palace that left Southampton in April 1912, was gone forever. But the truth about why it died, about who killed it, about the conspiracy that kept that truth hidden for so long, that was found, preserved, and finally revealed. And that's worth something. It's worth careers ended and risks taken and years of fighting against institutional resistance. Because in the end, the truth matters. The dead deserve to have their story told accurately, and history deserves to be recorded honestly, no matter how uncomfortable that honesty might be. The iceberg was never found because there was no iceberg. There was only murder, carefully planned and perfectly executed, then hidden behind a cover-up that lasted 3/4 of a century. But now you know. Now the world knows. And the 1/500 victims of the Titanic can finally rest, knowing that their story has been told and their deaths have been recognized for what they were, not a tragedy, but a crime. 35 years after I first descended to the Titanic wreck, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed a gravestone in a cemetery I didn't recognize. The name on the stone was Captain Nikolai Volkov, 1931-2019, he served truth above all else. The note read, Agent Whitmore, Captain Volkov asked that you receive this if anything happened to him. He wanted you to know that helping you expose the Titanic conspiracy was the proudest moment of his career, even though it ended his advancement in the Soviet Navy. He died believing that truth matters more than politics, more than nations, more than any of the reasons people give for keeping secrets. He considered you a friend even though you only met briefly. As do I. Thank you for never giving up. Yevgeny Volkov, Captain's son. I stood in my study, holding that photograph, and wept for a man I'd known for less than an hour, but who'd risked everything to help me find the truth. The investigation into the Titanic had cost me my career with the FBI. It had cost me relationships with colleagues who thought I was pursuing a conspiracy theory. It had cost me sleep, health, and years of my life fighting against institutional resistance. But it had also given me something irreplaceable, the knowledge that I'd done the right thing, even when it was hard, that I'd stood up for people who couldn't speak for themselves, that I'd refused to let powerful institutions bury the truth just because it was convenient. Agent Chen died in 2015, complications from pneumonia. At his funeral, his daughter told me that he'd kept all his notes from the Titanic investigation in his study, that he'd read through them regularly, reminding himself why he'd left the FBI and what he'd been fighting for. Agent Morrison is still alive, living in Colorado with his grandchildren. We talk once a month, old men reminiscing about the case that defined our careers. He tells me he has no regrets, that everything we sacrificed was worth it. Agent Rodriguez became a lawyer specializing in government accountability cases. She's argued before the Supreme Court 3 times, always fighting for transparency and truth in government. The Titanic investigation, she says, taught her that institutions need constant pressure from outside to do the right thing, because left to themselves, they'll always choose secrecy over honesty. Dr. Robert Ballard continued his oceanographic research for decades, discovering dozens of important shipwrecks and advancing deep-sea exploration technology. In interviews, he always said the Titanic investigation was both his greatest achievement and his greatest frustration. Greatest achievement because they found it. Greatest frustration because the full truth took so long to emerge. He died in 2032 at age 90, still advocating for the ocean depths to be explored and documented thoroughly. The Canor was decommissioned in 2003, replaced by more modern research vessels. I attended the ceremony, remembering those 3 days in the storm when we'd discovered evidence that would change history. The ship had served science well. It deserved its retirement. As for the Titanic itself, it remains at the bottom of the Atlantic, slowly deteriorating as bacteria and time do their inevitable work. Scientists estimate the wreck will completely collapse within another 50 years, the metal finally surrendering to corrosion and pressure. When it does, the last physical evidence of what happened that night will be gone, preserved only in photographs, videos, and the testimony of the few who saw it before it disappeared forever. But the truth will remain. That's what I learned from this case. Truth doesn't need physical evidence to persist, as long as people are willing to speak it and fight for it. The Titanic's truth survived 73 years of cover-up and suppression because somewhere, buried in classified archives and hidden in the memories of conspirators, the facts existed. All it took was someone willing to dig them out and refuse to be silenced. I'm often asked if I would do it all again, knowing what I know now about the personal and professional costs. The answer is always yes. The 1,500 people who died on the Titanic deserved to have their story told truthfully. They deserved justice, even if that justice came too late to punish the guilty or prevent the crime. Truth delayed is still truth. Justice delayed is still justice. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Titanic investigation. Not that powerful people conspire. We knew that already. Not that governments cover up inconvenient truths. That's obvious to anyone paying attention. The lesson is that secrets don't stay secret forever. Eventually, through persistence and courage and a bit of luck, the truth emerges. The conspirators die, the institutions that protected them change, and what once seemed impossible to reveal becomes public knowledge. The Titanic was never about an iceberg. It was never about tragic accident or human error. It was about power, money, and the willingness of people in positions of authority to sacrifice innocent lives for strategic objectives. It was about a conspiracy so vast that it involved multiple governments, lasted nearly a century, and reshaped how we understand one of history's most famous disasters. But it was also about something else. About the possibility of truth prevailing over lies, of justice being served even after nearly impossible delay, of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary power and refusing to back down. I'm an old man now, my time nearly done. The Titanic investigation was more than half a century ago, but I remember it like yesterday. The descent into the darkness, the moment I first saw the wreck, the torpedo lying in the sediment, the attack by the drones, the fight to get the evidence to Washington, and the longer fight to get the truth released. I remember it because it mattered, because it was the most important thing I ever did in 40 years of law enforcement, because I helped 1,500 dead people finally get their story told honestly. The iceberg was never found because there was no iceberg. There was only a lie, carefully constructed and maintained for 3/4 of a century, that eventually crumbled when confronted with evidence and persistence. And that gives me hope. Hope that other lies will eventually crumble. Hope that other conspiracies will be exposed. Hope that truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually prevail over power. The Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, but the truth about why it sank, that was found on September 1, 1985, 12,500 feet below the North Atlantic, by people who refused to accept the easy answers and demanded the difficult truth. I was one of those people, and I'm proud of it. The investigation is closed, the report is complete, the truth is known. Rest in peace, 1,500 victims of the Titanic. Your story has finally been told. This account is dedicated to all the victims of the RMS Titanic, and to the principle that truth matters more than convenience, more than politics, more than power. May we never forget what happens when powerful people believe they can murder with impunity and hide their crimes behind official narratives. And may we never stop fighting to expose those crimes, no matter how long ago they occurred or how powerful the forces protecting them. Agent David Whitmore, FBI, retired, December 2037.